They said a man born in chains could never wear a badge, that someone who grew up as property could never be trusted with the law, that his very nature was one of submission, not command. They said that in the raw, brutal world of the American frontier, a black man's authority would be a joke, a target for every outlaw and racist who thought their skin color made them superior. Yet, in the vast, lawless expanse of Indian Territory, a place that chewed up and spat out even the toughest of men, one former slave would rise. He would hunt down over 3,000 of the nation's most violent criminals, becoming a force of nature, a name that was whispered with a mixture of fear and awe in every saloon and hideout west of the Mississippi. The criminals thought it was absurd at first. Word would filter through the dusty trails that a colored deputy marshal was riding out of Fort Smith, that a former field hand was carrying warrants with their names on them. They would laugh over their whiskey, betting on how many days it would take before he was found face down in a creek. But those same outlaws would soon learn a terrible truth. They would learn about a man who could track a footprint across 100 miles of sun-baked rock, who could move through the wilderness like a ghost, who could shoot the button off a man's coat at 100 yards, and who, once he had your warrant, would never, ever give up. And by the time the dust settled, the name Bass Reeves would carry a weight so heavy that hardened killers would drop their guns and surrender at the mere sound of it. Imagine yourself in 1875. The Civil War had been over for a decade, but its ghosts still haunted the nation. The promise of Reconstruction was already beginning to curdle into the bitter reality of Jim Crow. And on the ragged edge of the American frontier, a place called Indian Territory, what would one day become Oklahoma, chaos reigned supreme. It was a vast, sprawling expanse of some 74,000 square miles, a rugged landscape of dense forests, rolling plains, and treacherous rivers where federal law barely existed. It was not a place of opportunity. It was a dumping ground, a refuge for the worst and most desperate outlaws the nation had to offer. Murderers fleeing a hanging judge in Arkansas, horse thieves from Texas, bootleggers, and entire gangs of bank robbers knew that crossing the border into the territory meant escaping the reach of most conventional lawmen. It was a sovereign land, home to the Cherokee, Creek, and other nations, but its very sovereignty made it a haven for criminals who ran wild through their lands. For a federal marshal, an assignment in Indian Territory was often a death sentence. Many refused to go. Those who did frequently didn't come back. The outlaws held every advantage. They knew the terrain, the secret canyons, the hidden trails. They had networks of sympathizers, isolated homesteads, where they could get a meal and a fresh horse. They could disappear into the wilderness for months, while any lawman who pursued them was a solitary, easily identifiable target. The statistics told a grim story. In the years before Bass Reeves put on a badge, dozens of deputy marshals had been killed in Indian Territory. They were shot from ambush while watering their horses, murdered in their sleep at lonely campsites, or simply vanished into the vastness, their fates never to be known. This was the challenge that faced Judge Isaac Parker when he took over the federal court in Fort Smith, Arkansas. His jurisdiction covered this entire lawless expanse. He was a stern, uncompromising man who would later become known as the hanging judge for the number of men he sentenced to death. But he also possessed a radical sense of justice for his time. He believed the law should apply equally to everyone, regardless of race or station. He needed deputies who could not just enforce the law, but survive it. He needed men who were tough, resourceful, and absolutely fearless. Men who knew the territory as well as the outlaws did, and who couldn't be bought off or intimidated. The old methods were failing. His deputies were dying. He needed something different. He needed a new kind of lawman, and someone, a savvy observer who understood the unique demands of the territory, suggested a name that would have been unthinkable to anyone else: Bass Reeves. The protests from some quarters were likely loud and immediate. "You can't give a badge to a colored man," they would have said. "The outlaws will see it as an insult, not a threat." Others would have been more direct in their racism, insisting he would run at the first sign of trouble or abuse his power. But Judge Parker listened, and then he made the decision that would change the history of American law enforcement. He didn't care about the color of the man's skin. He cared about whether he could do the job. And every piece of information he had suggested that Bass Reeves was not just qualified. He was, perhaps, the most qualified man on the continent for this impossible task. He was a man who had been forged in the very fire that was now consuming the frontier. The question was, would this former slave accept a badge from the same government that had once declared him to be 3/5 of a man? To understand the man who would accept Judge Parker's badge, you must first understand the world that had made him. Bass Reeves was not born a lawman. He was born property. In 1838, in the slave state of Arkansas, he entered a world that was designed from its very foundations to crush his spirit and deny his humanity. He was the legal property of a man named William Reeves, a farmer and later a state legislator. His early years were a relentless education in the brutal realities of bondage. From dawn until dusk, his life was a cycle of hard labor, performing whatever tasks his owner demanded. His body, not his own. His time, not his own. But even in the suffocating environment of the plantation, those who knew young Bass noticed something different, something that could not be chained. He possessed a quiet, watchful intelligence, an almost supernatural ability to observe and absorb the world around him. While others learned to keep their heads down, to become invisible to avoid the master's wrath, Bass watched. He studied the white men who claimed to own him and his family. He learned their patterns, their habits, their moments of weakness, their tells. It was the survival instinct of the hunted, honing itself into a formidable tool of psychological analysis. He was learning to read people, a skill that would one day be more valuable to him than any weapon. He also developed a set of practical skills that would, in a twist of profound irony, make him the perfect frontier lawman. He became an expert horseman, able to soothe and command even the most difficult and temperamental mounts. He was tasked with caring for his owner's animals, and in the process, he forged an almost mystical bond with them. More importantly, he learned to shoot. Initially, he was taught to handle a rifle to hunt game for his owner's table, to provide food for the very people who enslaved him. But what began as a chore quickly revealed itself to be a gift. He had a natural, almost God-given talent for marksmanship. He possessed an impossibly steady hand and a sharp, unerring eye. He could hit a turkey on the wing, a squirrel at the top of a towering oak. His skill with a firearm became a quiet legend on the plantation, a strange and unsettling talent for a man in his position. But the most important survival skill he mastered was the art of being underestimated. In a world where a black man's intelligence was a threat, where his confidence was seen as insolence, Bass learned how to wear a mask. He learned to let people see what they expected to see, a simple, unthreatening field hand. He learned to let them assume he was less intelligent, less capable, less observant than he really was. This skill, this ability to become a ghost in plain sight, would save his life more times than he could count. The great rupture in his life came with the Civil War. His owner, William Reeves, went off to fight for the Confederacy, and as was common practice, he took Bass with him, not as a soldier, but as a valet, a body servant. Bass was forced to serve a man fighting to preserve the very institution that held him in chains. He was a slave in the heart of the slaveholders' army. The details of what happened next have been clouded by the mists of time and legend. But the core of the story remains. There was a dispute, an argument, possibly over a card game. Tensions, already frayed by the chaos of war, finally snapped. Some stories say that William Reeves, in a fit of rage, struck Bass, and Bass, a man who had endured a lifetime of humiliation, finally pushed too far, struck back, knocking his owner to the ground. Others say that in the confusion of a battle, Bass simply saw his chance. Whatever the spark, the result was the same. Bass Reeves ran. He fled, not north, but west, into the one place he knew his owner's authority could not easily reach, the vast, wild expanse of Indian Territory. By crossing into the sovereign lands of the Creek, Seminole, and Cherokee nations, he was making a desperate gamble. He was trading the certainty of slavery for the uncertainty of life as a fugitive in one of the most dangerous places on the continent. For years, he lived in this wilderness, a man without a country, without a name, without legal existence. This was not a simple matter of hiding in the woods. These were established sovereign nations with their own laws, their own cultures, their own complex societies. Bass had to learn to navigate this new world, to earn the trust of people who had every reason to be suspicious of an outsider, especially one who had come from the world of the white man. He did it by being useful, by being respectful, and by proving himself to be a man of his word. He lived among the Creek and Seminole people, and in the process, his education as a frontiersman was completed. He learned their languages, becoming fluent in their tongues, a skill that allowed him to communicate and build bonds in a way no white man could. He learned to track, not just game for the cookpot, but to track men. The forests of Indian Territory were dense, the ground often hard and unforgiving, revealing little to the untrained eye. But Bass learned to spot the single broken twig, the disturbed leaf, the faint, almost invisible impression in the soil that told him a man had passed. He learned to read the wilderness like others read a book. He could tell how old a trail was, how many men were in the party, and how fast they were moving. He honed his marksmanship to a razor's edge, becoming deadly with both a rifle and, as he acquired one, a pistol. And perhaps most importantly, he developed a deep, intimate understanding of the territory's geography that few men, white, black, or Indian, could match. He learned the secret paths through the mountains, the hidden water sources in the dry plains, the caves and hollows where a man could disappear from pursuit. By the time the war ended and the 13th Amendment made him a legally free man, Bass Reeves was no longer just a runaway slave. He had transformed himself. He was a master frontiersman, a skilled tracker, a brilliant marksman, and a man who understood the complex cultural and geographical landscape of Indian Territory better than anyone. He had, through a crucible of fire and hardship, accidentally become the single most qualified man in America for the impossible job of taming it. He did not seek out the law. He settled down, bought a farm, married a woman named Nellie, and began to raise a family. He had a taste of peace for the first time in his life, but his reputation, a quiet legend whispered among those who knew the territory, had reached the ears of Judge Isaac Parker. And so, in 1875, a deputy arrived at his farm with an offer that was as shocking as it was dangerous. They wanted him to pin on a badge. For Bass, the decision must have been agonizing. To accept meant leaving the safety of his home, to once again plunge himself into a world of violence and danger. But it also meant something more. It was a chance to bring justice to a lawless land. It was a chance to prove, on the biggest stage imaginable, what a black man was capable of. And perhaps it was a chance to finally, definitively, be the master of his own destiny. He took the badge. When Bass Reeves pinned the silver star to his chest for the first time, he understood its weight. This was more than a piece of metal. It was a symbol of an authority that, for his entire life, had been used against him. Now it was his to wield. But it was also a heavy burden. He knew he was not just another deputy. He was an experiment, a test case in Judge Parker's radical vision of equal justice. Every arrest he made, every warrant he served, would be scrutinized. If he failed, his failure would be used as a weapon to justify the prejudice against every black person in America. They would say, "See, we told you they couldn't do it." But if he succeeded, if he proved he could not only survive, but thrive in the hell of Indian Territory, he might just change the course of history. He rode out of Fort Smith, not with a posse, but often alone, or with a single posseman, usually a trusted Indian man who would serve as a cook and guard for the prisoners. This in itself was a departure from the norm. Most deputies traveled in groups for safety, but Bass trusted his own skills, his own knowledge of the land, more than he trusted the courage of other men. His first assignments were tests, challenges designed to see if this former slave had the stomach for the job. Judge Parker didn't hand him easy warrants for petty thieves. He sent him into the heart of outlaw country, into the Choctaw and Chickasaw nations, after men who were wanted for murder, men who had killed before and would not hesitate to kill again. Imagine that first ride. A lone black lawman, a giant of a man at over 6 feet tall, powerfully built, riding into a territory where every shadow could hide a rifle barrel. He was a double outcast, a lawman in a land that hated the law, and a black man in a world dominated by white outlaws and suspicious Indian nations. He was a target from every conceivable angle. The outlaws he hunted were not common criminals. Many were Confederate veterans, men who had just fought a war to keep men like Bass in chains. The thought of being arrested by him was, to them, an unbearable humiliation, a fate worse than death. It was on these early missions that Bass Reeves began to develop the methods that would make him a legend. He understood that his greatest disadvantage, his race, could, with cunning, be turned into his greatest advantage. No one expected a black man to be the law. He used this to his advantage, becoming a master of disguise and deception in an era before photographs on wanted posters were common. He could shed his identity as a marshal like a snake sheds its skin. He would ride into outlaw territory not as a lawman, but as a ghost. He would pose as a poor itinerant farmer, his clothes ragged, his hat battered, asking for a meal and a place to sleep. He would play the part of a gunslinger on the run, spinning tales of crimes he'd supposedly committed to gain the confidence of the very men he was hunting. One of his earliest and most famous captures perfectly illustrates his genius. He had a warrant for 2 notorious outlaw brothers who were holed up in a remote cabin, their mother's home. They were known to be violent and had sworn they would never be taken alive. Previous deputies had tried to approach and had been driven off by a hail of rifle fire. A direct assault was suicide. So Bass came up with a plan that was as audacious as it was brilliant. He disguised himself as a tramp, a drifter on the run. He shot holes in his own hat to make it look old and worn. He walked for miles to wear down the heels of his boots and scuff his clothes. When he finally approached the cabin, he looked like a man at the end of his rope. He stumbled onto their porch, begging their mother for a drink of water, telling her a sob story about being hunted by a posse. The brothers, watching from inside, saw no threat, only a pathetic, harmless runaway. Their mother, taking pity on him, invited him in for a meal. He sat at their table, ate their food, and listened to them boast about their own crimes, all while secretly planning their capture. As they grew comfortable, he suggested they ride out with him. When they were a safe distance from the cabin, he revealed his badge and his guns. The shock was so total, so complete, that the brothers surrendered without a fight. They had been outwitted by the very man they had pitied. Stories like this began to filter back to Fort Smith, carried by the prisoners themselves. They spoke of this new deputy with a mixture of terror and grudging respect. He wasn't like the other lawmen. He didn't just charge in with guns blazing. He thought like them. He was patient. He was unpredictable. And he was absolutely relentless. The numbers began to speak louder than prejudice. While other deputies might return from a month-long trip with 1 or 2 prisoners, Bass Reeves would come back leading a train of 10 or 12, chained together, a grim procession of the territory's most wanted. His success rate was staggering. He almost never came back without his man. Judge Parker took notice. The other deputies, many of whom had been openly hostile or skeptical, began to fall silent. Their resentment was slowly being replaced by a grudging, undeniable respect. They might not socialize with him, but they knew that when a warrant was deemed impossible to serve, it was given to Bass Reeves, and it would be served. But not every arrest was a clean deception. The territory was an unforgiving place, and the men he hunted were desperate. There were brutal close-quarters shootouts in dark saloons, running gun battles on horseback across the open plains, and tense standoffs where a single wrong move meant death. Reeves was impossibly fast and accurate with his twin Colt .45s. The pistols he wore butt forward on his hips for a quick cross-draw. The legends of his marksmanship began to spread. They said he could shoot a man's gun belt off without touching his skin. They said he could hit a moving target in the dead of night. While these stories were likely embellished in the telling, the core was true. Bass Reeves was one of the finest shots on the frontier. He would kill 14 men in the line of duty, but always in self-defense, always after giving them a chance to surrender. His job, as he saw it, was to bring them back alive for Judge Parker to judge. In the saloons and hideouts of Indian Territory, the name Bass Reeves became a curse, a name spoken in hushed, fearful tones. The initial mockery of the colored Marshal had evaporated, replaced by a deep and abiding fear. Outlaws who had laughed at the idea of being arrested by a black man now told each other, "If Reeves has your warrant, you might as well give up or get out of the territory. He'll get you. It's not a question of if, but when." Some criminals, hearing that Reeves was on their trail, would simply turn themselves in to other, less formidable deputies, preferring the certainty of a jail cell to the terror of being hunted by the relentless ghost from Fort Smith. His reputation had become his most powerful weapon, a force that often disarmed men before he ever had to draw a pistol. The legend was being built, one warrant, one arrest, one impossible capture at a time. The former slave had become the most feared man in the most lawless land in America. By the early 1880s, Bass Reeves was no longer just another deputy. He was an institution, Judge Parker's most reliable and effective weapon against the chaos consuming Indian Territory. The warrants he was given were a who's who of the frontier's most dangerous and seemingly uncatchable men. These were not common criminals. They were experienced gunfighters, cunning strategists, and brutal killers who had evaded capture for years, often leaving a trail of dead lawmen in their wake. They had become legends in their own right, symbols of defiance against the encroaching law. And one by one, Bass Reeves was sent to hunt them down. His methods were a unique blend of wilderness skill, psychological warfare, and an almost eerie understanding of human nature. He worked from a foundation of meticulous preparation. Before he ever rode out, he would study his target. He would talk to informants, learn his quarry's habits, their friends, their weaknesses. He would build a psychological profile, understanding what a man feared, what he valued, what would make him lower his guard. He was a detective and a profiler in an era before those terms even existed. One of his most legendary pursuits was the hunt for Bob Dozier. Dozier was a stone-cold killer of incredible versatility, a cattle rustler, a bank robber, a horse thief, and a murderer who had successfully dodged the law for years. He was smart, cautious, and had a reputation for never sleeping in the same place twice. He had a network of friends and sympathizers who would hide him, and he had bragged openly that he would shoot any lawman who came for him, especially the black deputy. Multiple posses had tried and failed to corner him. He seemed to vanish into the thin air of the Cherokee Nation. Bass Reeves took the warrant and began his patient hunt. For weeks, he worked the trail, not of Dozier himself, but of his reputation. He talked to farmers, storekeepers, and blacksmiths, slowly piecing together a map of Dozier's movements and habits. He learned where Dozier liked to get his horses shod, where he bought his ammunition. He finally got a tip that Dozier would be at a specific cabin on a specific night. Reeves didn't ride in with a posse. He rode in alone. Under the cover of a moonless night, he approached the cabin with the silence of a predator. He dismounted, tied up his horse, and crept toward the house. He could hear voices inside. He peeked through a crack in the wall and saw his man. Instead of calling him out or kicking down the door, Reeves waited. He waited for hours in the cold darkness, his patience a weapon as potent as his pistols. Finally, when the occupants of the cabin had gone to sleep, he made his move. He didn't storm the house. He set it on fire. He lit a torch and threw it onto the dry roof of the cabin. As the flames erupted and smoke filled the house, the occupants, choking and panicked, burst out of the door. And there, standing in the flickering firelight, was the towering figure of Bass Reeves, his twin Colts leveled. "Bob Dozier," his deep voice boomed, "you're under arrest." Dozier, caught completely by surprise, reached for his gun. Reeves fired, his bullet finding its mark, and the legend of Bob Dozier came to a violent end. But it was his ability to bring men in alive that truly set him apart. His job was not to be an executioner. That was Judge Parker's role. His job was to deliver the accused to the courtroom. This often required a level of courage and restraint that was almost superhuman. There was the time he tracked 3 notorious outlaws, the Brunter brothers, for 2 weeks across brutal, unforgiving terrain. These were not amateurs. They knew he was on their trail, and they used every trick in the book to lose him. They split up. They doubled back to set ambushes. They traveled through streams to hide their tracks. Nothing worked. For 2 weeks, Reeves stayed on them, a relentless, inescapable presence. The outlaws grew desperate, exhausted, their nerves frayed to the breaking point by the knowledge that no matter what they did, he was still coming. Finally, he cornered them in a ravine. They were trapped, out of options, but they were still armed and dangerous. Instead of starting a gunfight that would have likely killed them all, Reeves used his most powerful weapon, his voice. He called out to them, not with threats, but with a calm, reasonable authority. He told them it was over, that they had run as far as they were going to run. He promised them that if they came out peacefully, no one would get hurt. After a long, tense silence, one by one, they emerged with their hands up, too tired and too psychologically beaten to fight. He had hunted them into submission. The physical hardship of these pursuits was immense. Months on the trail, sleeping on the hard ground in freezing rain or blistering heat, rationing food, and always being vigilant. His cook and possemen later recalled trips where they would cover hundreds of miles, and Reeves would seem to tire, subsisting on little more than water and an iron will. He'd get a few hours of sleep and be up before dawn, ready to ride again. He was shot at more times than he could count. On one occasion, a bullet tore through the brim of his hat, so close to his skull he could feel the heat of its passage. Another time, a bullet ripped his reins from his hands. But he was never seriously wounded, a fact that contributed to his growing aura of invincibility. It was as if he was protected by some higher power. His reputation began to do the work for him. Some outlaws, when they heard that Bass Reeves had their warrant, simply packed up and fled the territory entirely, preferring to take their chances in Texas or Kansas. A few of the smarter ones, knowing the futility of running, would surrender to other, less intimidating deputies. His very name had become a tool of law enforcement. But it was one particular case that would cement his reputation, not just as a skilled and courageous lawman, but as a man of unshakable, almost biblical integrity. It was the case that would define his career and become the ultimate testament to the principle that guided his entire life. The law applies to everyone equally, with no exceptions, not even for family. By 1884, Bass Reeves had become a force of nature on the frontier, a living legend whose exploits were told and retold in hushed tones around campfires and in the smoky back rooms of saloons. He had arrested over 1,000 of the territory's most violent men, survived countless gunfights, and outwitted criminals who thought themselves invincible. He had earned the respect of Judge Parker, the grudging admiration of his fellow deputies, and the absolute terror of the outlaws he hunted. But his greatest test was still to come. It would not be a test of his skill with a pistol, nor of his ability to track a man through the wilderness. It would be a test of his soul, a challenge that would force him to choose between his duty as a lawman and his love as a father. The warrant arrived like any other, a piece of paper issued from the court in Fort Smith, demanding the arrest of a man accused of murder. Warrants for murder were common, the grim currency of a lawless land. Bass Reeves had served hundreds of them, but this one was different. This one carried a name that must have made his blood run cold and his heart stop in his chest. William Reeves, his own son. The details of the crime were as tragic as they were serious. William, known as Benny, had gotten into a heated, jealous argument with his wife. In a moment of uncontrollable rage, the situation had escalated to violence. He had shot and killed her. There were witnesses. There was evidence. It was a clear, cut case of murder. And now there was a warrant with his name on it. A warrant that demanded he be brought back to Fort Smith to face the harsh and uncompromising justice of the hanging judge, Isaac Parker. The news hit the Marshal's service like a thunderbolt. The deputies gathered in small, quiet groups, whispering, speculating. The question on everyone's mind was the same. What would Bass do? This was an impossible situation, a conflict of loyalties that would have broken any ordinary man. Would he recuse himself, quietly passing the warrant to another deputy, claiming it was a conflict of interest? Would he use his immense influence, his legendary status, to protect his son, perhaps to arrange for him to disappear? Or would he, against all paternal instinct, ride out and arrest his own flesh and blood, knowing he was almost certainly sending him to the gallows? Many expected him to step aside. Some even hoped he would. They understood the agonizing position he was in. What father could be expected to hunt down and chain his own son? It was a test that seemed designed by a cruel and indifferent God. The pressure on Reeves must have been immense. His family, already grieving the loss of their daughter-in-law, now faced the horrifying prospect of losing their son. His wife, Nellie, the mother of his children, must have pleaded with him, begged him to find another way, to let someone else carry this terrible burden. Judge Parker, to his credit, seems to have left the decision entirely to Reeves. The old judge, who had handpicked Reeves for this dangerous job, knew the man's character better than anyone. He trusted him. He also knew that whatever Reeves decided would have consequences far beyond this one case. If Reeves failed to act, if he showed favoritism to his own family, his critics, the ones who had always whispered that a black man couldn't be trusted with a badge, would finally have their proof. His entire career, his entire legacy of impartial justice, hung in the balance. Bass Reeves did not hesitate. He did not waver. He walked into the Marshal's office, took the warrant, and read his son's name. His voice, when he spoke, was firm. His resolve absolute. "The law is the law," he is reported to have said. "It makes no difference whose name is on the warrant. It has to be served." And with those simple powerful words, he saddled his horse and rode out to find his son. Imagine that ride. The familiar weight of the badge on his chest suddenly heavier than it had ever been. The twin colts on his hips feeling like anchors, pulling him down. Every mile of the trail, every familiar landmark, bringing him closer to a confrontation no father should ever have to face. He had faced down hundreds of killers, gunfighters, and desperados. He had looked into the eyes of pure evil without flinching. But this was different. This was not some anonymous outlaw he could track with cold, professional detachment. This was his boy, someone he had held as an infant, taught to ride a horse, and hoped would build a good life for himself. The internal struggle must have been agonizing. Every instinct of fatherhood screaming at him to protect his child, to turn back. Every principle he had built his entire life and career upon pulling him forward. He could have let him go. He could have ridden out, made a show of searching, and returned to Fort Smith claiming his son had fled the territory, that the trail had gone cold. No one would have blamed him. Most would have silently understood and applauded his choice. But Bass Reeves had spent a decade proving that he was not like other men. He had proven that his word was iron, that his duty was sacred, and that justice in his hands was truly and absolutely blind. He found William hiding out in the territory. The arrest was clean, professional, and heartbreakingly private. Whatever words passed between father and son in that moment have been lost to history, locked behind the iron will of a man doing his terrible duty. Did he embrace his son one last time? Did he speak words of comfort or of condemnation? Did William plead with him, rage at him, or did he, knowing the man his father was, accept his fate with a quiet, tragic understanding? We will never know. What we know is that Bass Reeves returned to Fort Smith, his son in custody, ready to face the judgment of the court. The story of that arrest spread across the territory and beyond like a wildfire. It stunned everyone, from lawmen to the very outlaws they hunted. He arrested his own son, they would say to each other in disbelief. The statement carried an almost biblical weight. It destroyed, once and for all, any remaining argument that Reeves could be swayed by personal considerations, that his justice was anything less than absolute. If Bass Reeves would arrest his own flesh and blood, then no one, absolutely no one, was above the law. The act did something extraordinary. It transformed him from a legendary lawman into a symbol of pure, incorruptible justice. And it silenced his critics forever. What could they possibly say now? That a man who would send his own son to the gallows couldn't be trusted to wear a badge? The argument was absurd on its face. The experiment was over, and the result was undeniable. The trial of William "Benny" Reeves was a somber affair in Judge Parker's packed courtroom. People had come from across the territory, drawn by the morbid curiosity of a story that had already become a frontier epic. They came to see the legendary lawman, the man who had arrested his own son, and to witness the final, tragic act of this family drama. The central question was whether Bass Reeves, having done his duty by bringing his son in, would now try to use his influence to save him. Would he soften his testimony? Would he plead for mercy on his son's behalf? The moment was thick with tension. When Bass Reeves took the witness stand, a hush fell over the courtroom. He stood as he always did, a towering figure of quiet, unshakable authority. His face, a mask of weathered dignity, betrayed no emotion. His testimony was direct, factual, and devastating. He recounted what he knew of the case, presented the evidence he had gathered, and answered every question put to him by the prosecutor and the defense. He did not embellish, nor did he omit. He simply told the truth, as he had sworn to do. In that courtroom, under the stern gaze of Judge Parker, he was a deputy marshal first, and a father second. His loyalty was not to his blood, but to the law he had sworn to uphold. Benny Reeves was found guilty of murder. The verdict was expected, but then came a twist of fate, a small mercy in a story defined by harsh duty. Benny's lawyer, a former U.S. District Attorney, argued passionately for his client, and thanks to a combination of his skilled defense and perhaps the immense public sympathy generated by his father's agonizing choice, the jury recommended a sentence of life in prison, not death. The sentence was later reduced, and Benny was eventually pardoned, a free man once more, having served his time. But the process was agonizing for the entire Reeves family. Nellie Reeves had to watch her husband be the instrument of their son's imprisonment. The other children had to grapple with their father's almost incomprehensible choice. And Bass Reeves himself carried a burden that few could ever understand. He had upheld his principles, but at a cost that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He never spoke of it publicly, never used the story to aggrandize himself, or to justify his actions. The pain of that choice was a private cross he bore in silence. Those close to him saw the toll it took. Friends later recalled that Bass seemed to age visibly in the months following his son's conviction. The lines in his face deepened. The light in his eyes, always so sharp and watchful, dimmed slightly. He still did his job with the same relentless skill and determination, but there was a new weight on him, a profound sadness that had not been there before. When asked years later by a journalist if it was the hardest thing he had ever done, he simply said, "I did what the law required. That's all." For him, it was that simple and that terrible. The story of the arrest, however, did something extraordinary to his reputation. It ended, once and for all, any remaining doubt about his integrity. It transformed him from a feared lawman into a revered one. Critics who had spent years looking for any evidence that Reeves was corrupt, that he abused his authority, that he wasn't fit to wear the badge, suddenly had nothing left to say. What could they claim? That a man who would arrest his own son couldn't be trusted? The argument was absurd. Even those who hated what Bass Reeves represented, who despised the very idea of a black lawman holding authority over white men, had to begrudgingly acknowledge that he possessed a level of integrity that was as rare as it was absolute. His name now carried a new kind of power. It was no longer just a name that inspired fear. It inspired a grudging respect for the law itself. He had become a symbol of incorruptible justice in a land that had known very little of it. But the world around him was beginning to change. As the 1880s gave way to the 1890s, the wild, lawless character of Indian Territory was slowly being tamed. The railroads pushed through, bringing with them new towns, new settlers, and a new kind of civilization. The endless wilderness where outlaws could disappear was shrinking, being carved up into farms and ranches. The nature of the criminals was changing too. The era of the famous brazen outlaw gangs was beginning to fade. The new generation of criminals was often more cunning, their operations more sophisticated. But Bass Reeves adapted. He continued his work, his methods evolving with the times. He hunted down the infamous Tom Story gang, a group of horse thieves and murderers. He brought in the notorious Seminole outlaw, Greenleaf, who had a reputation for vanishing into thin air. He continued to pile up arrests, his total climbing past 2,000, then closing in on 3. He was in his 50s now, an age when most lawmen were thinking about retirement, their bodies broken down by years of hard living on the trail. But Bass kept riding. The physical toll was becoming more apparent. He walked with a slight limp, a reminder of a past gunfight. His hands were scarred and calloused. His face was a roadmap of his years under the sun and in the wind. But his skills were as sharp as ever. His eye was still true, his mind still cunning, and his determination was still absolute. Native Americans in the territory respected him deeply. He had lived among them, spoke several of their languages fluently, and always treated them with a dignity that was rare among white lawmen. He saw them not as savages to be subdued, but as a people with their own laws and their own right to respect. This relationship gave him a significant advantage, as many tribal members were willing to provide him with information and assistance, knowing that Reeves, unlike other deputies, would honor his agreements and treat them fairly. His career was a bridge between two eras. He was a man of the Old West, a tracker, and a gunfighter who operated on instinct and wilderness skill. But he was also a man who embodied a new kind of law, a law that was supposed to be impartial, consistent, and blind to the color of a man's skin. He was, in his own quiet way, a force of civilization, a man who, warrant by warrant, arrest by arrest, was helping to bring order to a place that had only known chaos. The legend was complete. He was no longer just a man. He was a symbol. And as the 19th century drew to a close, that symbol would face its final test. Not against a single outlaw, but against the relentless march of time and progress itself. As the 20th century dawned, Bass Reeves had become something few men ever achieve. A living legend, a relic from a wilder time, who was still actively working in a world that was rapidly passing him by. He was now in his 60s, an age when most of his contemporaries were either dead or retired. The Indian Territory he had known, that vast, untamed wilderness, was on the brink of disappearing forever, soon to be absorbed into the new state of Oklahoma. The era of the horseback marshal, the lone lawman hunting outlaws across thousands of square miles, was coming to an end. But Bass Reeves was not done yet. His arrest count had climbed past 3,000, a number so staggering, so almost comically vast, that it strains belief. To put it in perspective, that's an average of nearly 2 arrests every single week, for over 30 years straight. And these were not simple drunk and disorderly cases. These were warrants for murderers, horse thieves, and violent fugitives who had to be tracked across hundreds of miles of brutal terrain. Each arrest represented days, sometimes weeks, of relentless work, of danger, of skill. The total represents a career so remarkable, so far beyond the scope of any other lawman of his era, that he stands in a category all his own. Wyatt Earp, for all his fame, made only a fraction of the arrests Bass Reeves did. Wild Bill Hickok's career was a flash in the pan compared to Reeves's 3 decades of service. He was, by any objective measure, the single greatest lawman of the American West. But the world was changing. In 1907, Oklahoma officially became the 46th state. The legal landscape was transformed overnight. The old system of federal marshals operating out of Fort Smith, the system under which Reeves had worked for his entire career, was dissolved. The vast jurisdiction of Judge Parker's court was carved up, and law enforcement was handed over to local sheriffs and newly formed police departments. At the age of 69, after 32 years of the hardest and most dangerous work imaginable, Bass Reeves's career as a U.S. Deputy Marshal was over. He was, for the first time in his adult life, out of a job. He could have retired. God knows he had earned it 1,000 times over. He could have spent his remaining years on his farm with his family, resting in the peace he had fought so hard to bring to others. But the quiet life was not for him. The law was in his blood. So, instead of retiring, he took a job that was, in many ways, a sad and poignant epilogue to his legendary career. He became a patrolman for the Muskogee Police Department, one of the first black police officers in the new state of Oklahoma. Imagine the sight. The legendary Bass Reeves, the man who had hunted down the Doziers and the Brunters, the man whose name had been a terror to the outlaw gangs of an entire territory, now walking a beat. The work was different, a world away from the high drama of his old life. There were no more month-long tracking expeditions, no more sleeping under the stars, no more tense confrontations with desperate killers in remote cabins. Now it was dealing with petty thieves, domestic disputes, and enforcing city ordinances. The man who had been a king of the wilderness was now a guardian of the city streets. But he brought the same unwavering discipline and absolute integrity to this new, humbler role. He patrolled his assigned district with the same quiet authority he had brought to hunting outlaws. And a remarkable thing was said about his time as a Muskogee police officer. In the 2 years that he walked his beat, there was not a single reported crime in his district. Not one. His reputation, it seemed, was still the most effective law enforcement tool in the state. Criminals, both petty and professional, knew who he was, and they simply chose to operate elsewhere. The old lion, even on a short leash, was still the king of the jungle. He was a respected, even beloved figure in Muskogee. People who met him on the street, who saw this elderly, dignified black policeman walking his beat, had no idea of the incredible history that lay behind his calm and watchful eyes. But those who knew his story, who understood what he had accomplished, saw a living piece of American history walking among them. He was known for his kindness to children, often stopping to talk with them, telling them carefully edited stories of his adventures, emphasizing the importance of honesty and hard work. For the black children of Muskogee, he was a powerful symbol, living proof that they could aspire to something greater, that the color of their skin did not have to define their destiny. He worked for the Muskogee police until 1909, when his health, compromised by decades of exposure and hard living, finally forced him to stop for good. He was 71 years old and had given nearly 35 years of his life to law enforcement, a career unmatched in its scope, its impact, and its sheer, breathtaking numbers. When he turned in his badge for the last time, it marked the end of an era. The Wild West was well and truly over. The frontier was closed, and Bass Reeves, the greatest lawman that Frontier had ever produced, was finally going home. His final year was a quiet and difficult one. His health deteriorated rapidly. The man who had seemed so strong, so indestructible, was confined to his home, growing weaker each day. He faced his approaching death with the same calm dignity he had brought to everything else in his life. On January 12, 1910, at the age of 71, Bass Reeves died of Bright's disease, a kidney condition. The news spread quickly through Muskogee and beyond. His funeral was attended by hundreds of people from all walks of life. Lawmen came from across Oklahoma to pay their respects to a man who had been their inspiration and their standard-bearer. Judges and politicians attended, honoring a man who had helped to bring civilization to their new state. And ordinary citizens, both black and white, came to say goodbye to a man who had made their world a safer place. The newspapers, which in his early years had barely acknowledged his work or had covered it with thinly veiled racism, now ran extensive obituaries, finally recognizing him as one of the greatest lawmen in American history. The Muskogee Phoenix wrote, "In the history of the early days of Oklahoma, the name of Bass Reeves has a place in the front rank. No story of the conflict of government's officers with outlaws can be complete without mention of Bass Reeves." It was a final, belated acknowledgement of a greatness that had been undeniable for decades. The legend was gone, but the legacy was just beginning its long, slow journey into the heart of American history. The death of Bass Reeves in 1910 should have marked the beginning of his ascent into the pantheon of American folk heroes. His life was the stuff of legend, a story so epic, so quintessentially American, that it seemed destined to be told and retold for generations. He was the real-life Lone Ranger, the ultimate frontier hero, a man who had arrested more criminals, survived more gunfights, and demonstrated more unwavering integrity than almost any other figure of the Wild West. His story had all the elements of a great American myth, and yet, for the better part of a century, America chose to forget him. The story of his erasure is, in its own way, as important and as revealing as the story of his life. In the decades following his death, as the reality of the Wild West faded into the romanticized fiction of Hollywood and pulp novels, A new set of heroes was being cast in the national imagination. Names like Wyatt Earp, Wild Bill Hickok, and Bat Masterson became household words, their exploits often heavily embellished, forming the backbone of the American Western myth. These were the men who were celebrated in books, in movies, on television. They were the faces of frontier justice, and they were all white. In this new, sanitized narrative of the West, there was no room for a figure like Bass Reeves. His story was an inconvenient truth. The very idea of a black man, a former slave, being the most effective and respected lawman on the frontier was a direct challenge to the racial hierarchies that the nation was so desperately trying to reinforce in the era of Jim Crow. You cannot simultaneously celebrate a black man's authority and courage while also passing laws that declare him an inferior citizen, unfit to vote or to share a water fountain with a white person. The hypocrisy is too glaring. So, the simpler solution was to simply erase him. This erasure was not a conscious, centralized conspiracy. It was something more insidious, a systemic act of cultural amnesia. The historians who wrote the first popular accounts of the Old West were products of their time, and they focused on the stories of the white lawmen they deemed important. The Hollywood studios that created the Western genre were in the business of selling a particular kind of American myth, a myth of rugged white individualism, and a black hero did not fit that profitable narrative. Textbooks, which for generations presented a whitewashed version of American history, simply omitted him. The result was profound. Generations of American children, both black and white, grew up learning about the gunfight at the OK Corral, but never heard of the man who arrested over 3,000 criminals. They knew the name of Jesse James, the outlaw, but not the name of the lawman, who was more effective than all the Earps combined. Bass Reeves, the man who had been a living legend in his own time, was rendered a ghost, a footnote in a history that had no room for his greatness. The personal cost of this erasure was felt by his family, his descendants, who carried the memory of his incredible life, but saw it reflected nowhere in the culture around them. But the greater cost was to the nation itself. By forgetting Bass Reeves, America impoverished its own history. It lost a hero who embodied its highest ideals: courage, integrity, and an unwavering commitment to justice. It lost a story that could have served as a powerful counter-narrative to the poison of racism. A story that proved that a man's worth is not determined by the color of his skin, but by the content of his character. The irony is that while his real story was being forgotten, a fictionalized, whitewashed version of it may have been captivating the nation. Many historians now believe that the character of the Lone Ranger, one of the most iconic heroes in American pop culture, was at least partially inspired by the life of Bass Reeves. The parallels are striking. The Lone Ranger was a peerless tracker and marksman who operated in the West, often using disguises. He rode a magnificent horse and was accompanied by a Native American companion, Tonto. He lived by a strict moral code, never shooting to kill. Bass Reeves was a peerless tracker and marksman who operated in Indian territory, was a master of disguise, rode a magnificent horse, and often worked with a Native American posseman. He lived by a strict moral code, and he famously never lost a passenger on the Underground Railroad, and always tried to bring his prisoners in alive. Whether the creators of the Lone Ranger consciously based their character on Reeves is a matter of historical debate. But it is impossible to ignore the echoes. It is as if the culture could only process a story of a black hero by turning him into a white man wearing a mask. The true face of frontier justice was deemed too challenging, too revolutionary for a mainstream audience. The work of rediscovering Bass Reeves began slowly, quietly, in the latter half of the 20th century. It was led primarily by African American historians and writers who were on a mission to uncover the forgotten stories of black achievement, to reclaim a history that had been stolen. They dug through the dusty court records of Fort Smith. They scoured old newspaper archives from Oklahoma and Arkansas. They pieced together his story, warrant by warrant, arrest by arrest, slowly reconstructing the incredible mosaic of his life. Gradually, the truth began to emerge. This was not a minor figure or an interesting footnote. This was, by any objective measure, a giant of American history. His arrest record was real and verifiable. The stories of his courage and cunning were documented in contemporary accounts. His legacy of integrity was undeniable. As this evidence mounted, the historical establishment could no longer ignore him. Books began to be written. Documentaries were produced. And slowly, painstakingly, Bass Reeves began to re-emerge from the shadows. He was being restored to his rightful place in the American story, not as a sidekick or a footnote, but as a central character, a true hero of the West. The fight against erasure was beginning to be won, a century after his death. The legend was coming home. So what is the final, enduring legacy of Bass Reeves? It is a story that operates on two profound and equally important levels. First, there is the story of the man himself, a tale of almost mythic heroism, a testament to the power of individual courage and unbreakable will in the face of impossible odds. But second, and perhaps more importantly, there is the story of his forgetting and his rediscovery, a narrative that reveals uncomfortable truths about America's relationship with its own history and its own heroes. The legacy of the man is a direct and powerful challenge to the very foundations of prejudice. Bass Reeves was born into a system that declared him to be property, less than human, incapable of the virtues of honor, discipline, and authority. He responded by becoming the living embodiment of those very virtues. In a world of chaos, he was a force of order. In a world of corruption, he was a symbol of incorruptible integrity. In a world that judged him by the color of his skin, he judged other men only by their actions. His entire life was a performance of excellence, so profound, so undeniable, that it shattered every racist stereotype that was thrown at him. He did not argue against the lie of black inferiority. He simply, quietly, and relentlessly proved it wrong, day after day, for 32 years. His story redefines what it means to be a hero of the American West. The heroes we were given in the movies were often morally ambiguous gunfighters, men who operated in a gray area between the law and lawlessness. Bass Reeves was not that. He was a man of the law, through and through. His mission was not personal glory or vengeance. It was the patient, difficult, and often thankless work of building a just society. His arrest of his own son is the ultimate testament to this. It was an act of profound personal sacrifice, a demonstration that his commitment to the principle of equal justice was absolute, a creed he was willing to follow, even when it broke his own heart. He represents a different, more profound kind of heroism, not the heroism of the quick draw, but the heroism of unwavering character. But the legacy of his erasure is just as powerful. The fact that a man of this stature, a hero this significant, could be so completely written out of the national narrative is a chilling lesson in how history is made, and for whom. His story was forgotten, not because it wasn't true, or because it wasn't important, but because it was inconvenient. It was a story that did not fit the racially segregated script that America wanted to write for itself in the 20th century. To celebrate Bass Reeves would have been to admit that a black man could be the ultimate symbol of American justice, and that was a truth that the era of Jim Crow and Hollywood westerns was not prepared to handle. By forgetting him, America did more than just dishonor a great man. It impoverished its own soul. It lost a hero who embodied its highest ideals. It lost a story that could have served as a powerful antidote to the poison of racism, a story that proved beyond any doubt that courage and character have no color. The rediscovery of his story in our own time is, therefore, an act of historical justice. It is a restoration, a reclaiming of a piece of the American identity that was lost. Today, Bass Reeves's legacy is finally taking its rightful place. Statues have been erected in his honor in Oklahoma and Arkansas. Bridges have been named after him. His life is being taught in schools, and his story is finally being told in books and on screen. He has inspired a new generation of artists, writers, and historians who see in him a hero for our time, a man whose quiet dignity and relentless pursuit of justice resonate deeply in our own troubled era. So, when you think of the American West, do not just think of the cowboys and the outlaws of the movies. Think of the real-life hero who was greater than any of them. Think of the man who was born a slave and became a legend. Think of the man who wore a badge over a heart that knew both the pain of bondage and the fierce clarity of justice. Think of the man who, when faced with an impossible choice, chose his duty over his son. They said a man born in chains could never wear a badge. He responded by arresting over 3,000 men. They said he could never command respect. His name became a synonym for fear and awe on the frontier. They tried to forget him, to bury his story beneath a century of myth-making. But a legend this powerful cannot be contained forever. The story of Bass Reeves is not just Black history. It is American history, in its most brutal, most complex, and most inspiring form. His journey is over, but his legacy, the quiet, unshakable truth of his life, will ride on forever.